Well, it's amazing to see all the participants coming in. We already have 120 participants here in this webinar. The webinar panel discussions today from SIETAR Europe, biases on intercultural communication. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and especially our four panelists for today. Eila Isotalus, welcome. Amer Ahmed, hi, nice seeing you here. Livingstone Thompson, great having you here, and also Christian Hoerfle. We have four amazing speakers in this panel discussion, and it's so great to see you all, and a warm welcome. And please use the chat as we all do, and many of you are familiar by now how it works, and introduce yourself in the chat by saying where you're currently logging in from. And I see everybody already coming in. As you've noticed, we have started recording. This will also be, the recording will always be on our YouTube channel after the session. And special thanks today for the virtual events team for setting up the technical part of this webinar. Well, let me introduce myself. My name is Yvonne van der Poel. I'm a member of the board of directors of SIETAR Europa. I'm representing SIETAR Netherlands in the board. And I'm currently also interim president of SIETAR Netherlands. And in SIETAR Europe, I'm active in the Community Development Committee, and we currently run capacity building meetups in order to enhance the learning amongst national SIETAR organizations and special interest groups. And of course, today's topic and diversity, inclusion, anti-racism has also been on our calendar. Well, what about our session today? Of course, it all started, well, maybe not even in May, but of course it is very apparent that the killing of George Floyd on May 25th was really a starting point for us to look thoroughly at anti-racism within our community. But it had been an ongoing discussion also within the board of directors, talking about intersectionality and diversity and inclusion in the field that we're working with. So we send out this commitment, anti-racism commitment, but also a commitment to action. And one of the action points is, of course, to educate ourselves. And that's exactly what we're doing in these webinars, but we're taking this also more broadly. And what we're aiming for is also to become a more inclusive community as such. In order to run this webinar well smoothly and also according to our principles of inclusiveness and celebrating diversity, we also have some created over time some guidelines for the chats. And we've noticed the chat is very important to have an additional conversation next to what's happening here in the panel. Sometimes resources are being shared. And it's important to notice that we also want to, well, walk our talk. So please be respectful towards each other, be constructive, have a listening and open-mindedness. So currently these guidelines have been shared in the chat as well. And we have two colleagues of the board of directors who are also active in the chat, Carla Cabrera and Tamara Thorpe. Thank you so much for being around and have this role in the chat. Well, let me introduce the panelists. And Eila Isotalus, thank you for waving. You have received your master's degree in intercultural communications and international relations from the university, and I don't know if I pronounced this right, Jyväskylä in Finland. And you're currently furthering your studies in the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. And at an Institute of Education in the University College in London to obtain your doctorate degree in sociolinguistics. Eila has worked since 2005 in her company Unidos Hoy in personal development for organizations both in the private, public and third sectors for groups ranging from teachers to doctors, from HR personnel and multicultural team leaders to officials working with migrants. She has consulted organizations in diverse processes, developing processes of intercultural competence development in different fields, and including making intercultural competence mainstream in HR activities. Enhancing anti-racist pedagogy with teachers, and in creating training programs for coaches of multicultural groups in sports. She has worked also at the University of Helsinki and Aalto University in Finland. She has a talent for explaining everyday experiences with theory and helping participants to make sense of their everyday experience. And she also makes it easy to apply learning to everyday situations. Welcome here, and great that you also have initiated this conversation. Amer Ahmed, also warm welcome to you. And you're a doctorate in education. You're founder and CEO of AFA Diversity Consulting, LLC, a consulting practice dedicated to enhancing the development of organizations through leadership, professional development, assessment, and strategic change. In addition, he currently serves as interim chief director officer and executive director of equity and inclusivity at Dickinson College, and is member of Speak Out, an institute for democratic education. Dr. Ahmed's approach is grounded in social justice and commitment to community. He is a host of the Eclectic Inclusion podcast and has been featured in media such as MSNBC, documentary film, and other national press outlets. He also has keynoted prominent conferences, including the National Conference on Race, Ethnicity in Higher Education, the Global Engagement in Liberal Arts Conference, and SIETAR conferences. Thanks, Amer. Great to have you here today. Christian Hoerfle, he's a cultural coach, trainer and mentor for multinational organizations, or rather for people who work globally. You're based in Atlanta, and he's German by passport, American by choice, and Bavarian at heart, and people call him the culture guy. His passion is to help discover commonality when they are overwhelmed by difference. And his mission is to create peace by facilitating understanding, relating, and connecting. At the core of this purpose is culture. And as he helps people figure out this thing called culture, they'll work at their peak and in peace with each other. Throughout his career, Christian has had the privilege of working with people from all over the world. And within his company, The Cultural Mastery, Christian and his team serve multinational organizations achieve their goals in the global markets. TCM does this via tailored coaching and training programs for expats as well as multicultural teams. Well, welcome to you as well, Christian, and Livingstone Thompson. Also, welcome to you. You're an experienced intercultural trainer with specialities across a variety of corporate fields. As a member of the IRIS Institute of Training and Development, Livingstone provides consultancy, research and training in cultural awareness and diversity management. His doctoral studies in culture and pluralism, undertaken at the University of Dublin, the Trinity College, were successfully completed in 2003. The doctoral research focused on dialogue between Christian and Islamic cultures. Special emphasis in his research was placed on contemporary intercultural theories and the work of the 17th century interculturalist Jan Komensky, after whom the Intercultural Project in the European Union is named. Livingstone was also awarded a Master of Philosophy from Trinity College in Dublin in 2000. He's author of several books and peer-reviewed articles. His professional involvement includes serving as president of SIETAR Europa. From his bases in the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland, Livingstone has delivered country-specific training for the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Jamaica, his first home country. Well, welcome to all of you, and Eila, to start with you. You and your work have been a catalyst actually for this panel. And can you share with us the work that you're doing and how this inspired our conversation?
Thank you for kind introduction, and I'm really happy to be here. I have been working as a trainer on intercultural competence or intercultural communication several years, and like there has been kind of uneasiness with certain theories that were often used in intercultural fields, specifically those based on nations and formed as a dichotomy. But I think over the years, I managed to kind of frame an approach that made sense for me, combining different kind of other theories. However, now when I started my PhD work and I did my ethnographic field work in an asylum center, which, as you may imagine, well, there are asylum seekers that are staying in the center for a longer period of time while they are waiting for their decisions. It is very intercultural place, to put it so. The residents, the asylum seekers come from different countries, they have different religions, they have different languages. Actually, there were no one common language in common as such. I went there, I'm telling this example because this was exactly what kind of pushed me to think these kind of issues once more. My topic is not exactly related directly with intercultural communication, but anyhow, after I had been there some months, altogether I was there for a year, I started to think that how could I apply the theories of intercultural communication or intercultural competence? Now, I would refer, for example, intercultural communication competence theories by Bayram, or development of intercultural sensitivity by Bennett, or things like that. How could I use them or get tools to for the people who were in the center? Because that was quite of a complicated situation for many, and then realizing that actually these theories that tend to be used there didn't make any sense to the asylum seekers that were living there. But instead, for the workers, they did. And then I think that makes so visible the bias that these theories are actually made for from that one specific angle and from this specific perspective for white Western people that are working with others, meaning that actually the setting kind of puts the other people, marks the people as the other, not the white Western. So like the idea that many of the theories are kind of normative, setting the scene. This is how it should go, kind of an ideal interculturalist, and that they don't specify the context. And as they don't do so, they give an impression as they would be neutral, generalizable, universal, applicable to all contexts, all situations, to all people. But when we start to look like how they are developed and often also adapted, it discloses the white Euro-American privilege perspective that we are often also talking about: expatriates, business, international mobility, this kind of volunteer mobility. That is also understandable when we look at the history of those theories. However, that is not explicit, but they are presented as universal. And at the same time, thinking that in today's world, the context of forced migration is one of the main intercultural contexts, if not the main. And thinking that they don't really, like, it's not only the lack of context, but it's also that the structures there are not recognized. Like this context of asylum seeking has pronounced asymmetrical power positions. Where both the workers and also me as a researcher, we have certain kind of role of power. We know the system different. We have the kind of networks there. So there is this kind of emphasis on the individual, on the theories as well, because these structures, contexts are not really included. So that realization was what pushed me rethink a lot of issues. Yeah. And I continue to be that journey. So this asking difficult questions or comfortable questions. Yeah. So that is why I wanted to bring this topic to the panel.
Well, thank you for bringing the topic to the panel, and you're making very valid points also about the amount of people who are in this situation of a forced migration, and are the theories that we work with relevant? Let me hand over to you, Amer Ahmed. Can you tell us about your work, the work you do, and how well this relates to you, your vision and perspective? And please unmute yourself.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've been working in US American higher education for most of my professional career, particularly with a focus on the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'll contextualize that in a second. But something about my background is that my family are immigrants from India and Muslim, a minoritized population with limited access to education and resources for amongst many in India, and that was true for my family as well. And so access to higher education was a huge opportunity in my family that created the opportunity for my family to come to the United States. And then I was raised in a prototypically post-industrial environment in the Midwest of the United States, in the state of Ohio. Again, lots of jobs going away, manufacturing jobs in particular, people falling into poverty in an environment where most people were either white or Black American, and I was neither. And negotiating, and the moment I left my home, I was moving between these spaces. And for college and my master's degree, I studied cultural anthropology and Black studies. And I studied abroad in South Africa in 1998 during the Truth and Reconciliation process when Mandela was president in Durban, South Africa, the largest Indian population outside of India in the world. And suddenly I had a racial place in that mix on a campus that had only recently been integrated with this, particularly challenging racial history of segregation and only recently being desegregated on their campuses. And so this created kind of a global sense of what had happened in the world as related to colonialism, thinking about my own background, think about where I grew up, moving between spaces, navigating the educational component of Black studies and Black diaspora studies in relationship to cultural anthropology, which was historically dominated by white men. And oftentimes in that field, me feeling like this was white men telling me what culture was. And a lot of it didn't resonate with me and my understanding and experience of culture. And as I went into higher education and diversity, equity, inclusion, and did work around anti-racism, which is what I was primarily motivated around, and then myself being racialized in a newly acute way post 9/11, really being motivated on wanting to dismantle racism, but also finding a lot of resistance from white Americans around confronting the truth and realities of how racism functions systemically in our organizations and institutions, and looking for an alternative path. How can I find a way to be able to reach more people? And I got exposed to the intercultural approach, which made a lot of sense to me with my anthropology background, but I was concerned about the lack of an emphasis of a power analysis. And so for years, I went to the Summer Institute for Intercultural Communication in Oregon, eventually started teaching workshops on bridging intercultural with social justice in a globalized context in which colonialism has had implications all over the world, and an interconnected relationship between the local and global, and how that's functioning in a globally capitalistic world. And so for myself, I did not view these things as uniquely American. The specific ways in which we go about talking about these things in the United States is based on a particular historical context in the United States in which we've had slavery, we've had legal segregation, and we have institutionalization of racism and other forms of systemic inequity around sexism, homophobia, and so forth and so on. And that doesn't always translate cross-culturally. And I think that's where, when we start to bring this work that really came out of civil rights movements in the United States around access and equity in institutions and systems in the United States, when we try to take that to Europe, when we try to take that to Latin America or different places in the world, sometimes people feel like, well, this is a US conversation. And so what I try to help people understand is that historically based systems of inequity exist everywhere, right? The constructs may be different. How they function in relationship to culture may be different, but the inequity exists. And if we're engaging intercultural work in a dehistoricized manner that does not have an explicit power analysis, it becomes difficult to account for the way inequity is functioning and operating as we engage across difference. That when a person from Senegal is interacting with what I would call a white French person, that is not just a cultural interaction. there is a power dynamic in that encounter based on history and inequity. And so we have to account for that. And so the constructivist frame that the intercultural brings, it emphasizes the agency of the individual to negotiate their experience and does not account for the way power presses on your identity and potentially forces assimilation, right? And the reality is that it's both and. We have agency as individuals, but there's also power that's pressing on our agency and how we negotiate our experience.
Yeah, and how to reconcile both ends, and the power and the individual agency. Well, thank you so much, Amer, for taking this first shot here. Christian, you've been working globally for a long period of time. You're working as a cultural coach and trainer. What do you like to share here from this point, and also like to get out of this conversation today?
Well, first of all, thank you for allowing me into this last round of academic prowess, because I feel a little bit like an outsider because I don't share the academic underpinning that many of you have. I come to this field from a certain corner that was more probably business and personal related rather than from an academic perspective. So first of all, I want to congratulate Amer on what you just said and echo what Kelly put in the chat. Preach it, Amer, preach it. That was powerful. So the first thing I would say is I'm here to learn, because I see my work as perpetual learning for myself, not just passing on personal experience and knowledge to others. So the two stories that came up for me while I listened to you was the way I approached the concept of race and racism growing up in West, and I say West Germany because that's where I grew up. I grew up as a child in a divided country. And then how I experienced the concept of race abroad, first as a teenager and then as an adult. And for me, growing up in the 70s and 80s, yes, I'm that old, race was something to be curious about. My generation, the Generation Xers in Germany, the ones that I hung out with, they had this desire to learn about other ethnicities, other cultures, other languages, other approaches to social structure, norms, and as Amer rightfully said, power distribution as it relates to ethnicity and race. And then I struggle with the word race in and by itself. So I'm so torn and have been torn for years. Why is that even a concept that we're discussing? Right, because it's an artificial concept. It's a white European-made concept in my experience, and it's manifested and it's been perpetuated via the exertion of power, mainly coming from colonial Europe and then colonial North America. So for me, that concept was always like, what is this? Why are we talking about this? There's so much to discover. I want to learn more about this. And then I came to the United States as a foreign exchange student in the late 80s. And something that I'll never forget happened in high school. It was in northwestern Minnesota, brutally cold, flat land. So those of you who've been to the United States, you know what I'm talking about. Those of you who watched the movie Fargo, yes, there. And there was this question, and among 17-year-olds, there is this bonding ritual. Back then, there was this bonding ritual. Hey, what kind of music do you listen to? What pop culture is relevant to you? And then you list what's relevant to you at that moment. And then you find out, do you have something in common with the other person? Is there a common ground where we can find ways to be with each other? So I ran down my list of music that was very important to me at that age. And the majority white fellow students at that school looked at me and said, well, yeah, that's pretty much all Black music. And I didn't know what to respond. I was so dumbfounded. I was like, yeah, maybe. I never looked at music that way because music sounds to me. It doesn't have a color. Music is sound, emotion, regardless of the color of the musician who creates it. So I struggled as a 17-year-old, I struggled with this very idea. And then they said, well, don't you like any of, and then they went down their laundry list of music that was culturally relevant to them. And I said, well, not my cup of tea, let's part ways. I never looked at race through that lens up until that day.
Mm-hmm.
So that experience of having at that young age where teenagers are so much influenced by their homes and their environment and their school systems, recognizing that at that age, apparently race or the construct of race and ethnicity apparently informs so much of people's decision-making subconsciously, surprised me and later on angered me. And you can tell I'm emotionally charged around this. It still angers me tremendously.
Yeah. And
so I hope this answers the question.
Yeah, at least as a starting point also for our conversation, because we also have Livingstone in our panel. And actually what your story reminds me of also is in the last SIETAR Europe Congress in Leuven, Livingstone, you also had a panel or a session there, a workshop, and exactly you pointed out of the concept of race and how we as interculturalists deal with this. But maybe that's not what you want to say as the introduction in this panel. So I give the floor to you, but I see some parallel here between the two speakers.
Thanks, Yvonne. And I mean, in a sense, it's a very good and interesting starting point, because one of the things that I learned very well in that panel is that, you know, there are different ways in which this unreal concept, different attitudes that we have to it. And so we have to use it with sensitivity, either when we exclude it or when we include it, because for some people, it's important not to lose sight of it with quotation marks. And then for other people, it's important to keep it with a quotation mark. So this is very important. But from my own point of view, I mean, where I come to this conversation in terms of what I bring from a background point of view, my own formation, and I suppose what they regard as the thing that influences me most now when I engage with this issue and issues relating to the whole field of intercultural communication and understanding it, is from my background in the Caribbean, where I grew up learning very early that the framework that I had to engage with was a received philosophical framework that had to be, first of all, understood and be engaged with. So the idea that how I understand any of the concept which was very popular and which predominated, that they came from a context where they were loaded with meaning in that context. And so the whole idea of decolonizing was something that I entered into early. My primary background is in theology. So the whole idea of understanding how to decolonize theology, which has its own very strong, not only moral and emotive, but supreme, you know, the concept of being supreme and authoritative, that becomes important, because then becomes a deconstruction of the world, essentially, because so much of the world is formed by these religious notions. So one of the things that I understood as I came into the European context is that the concept of decolonizing and the need to appreciate that these concepts are not universal, for the most part, didn't exist among the individuals with whom I was engaging. So when I then looked at the question of racism and realized that as many of my colleagues in university and all, I spoke about racism, it was never about where racism began, having to do with the understanding of the colonial period and power. So I found that understanding that there's a connection between power and money at the root of racism, that they are beneficiaries. Only this morning I was trying to explain to a colleague who was writing a paper on racism to say, you have to say it very, very concretely in terms of beneficiaries, so that racism benefits some people, and those who benefit it try to justify it or try to deny it. And there are those, it is therefore important to understand the connection between racism, between power and money in the concept of racism. And as I work here in Northern Ireland, largely now with migrants from the Caribbean and Africa, and as they struggle to find how to make their own contributions to a society that has constructed itself, especially in Northern Ireland, traditionally between those who are orange and green, really mean those are kind of a Protestant religious divide as a way of understanding the society, and then to try to find a different way to explain the reality in which we are living. I find how important it is to understand the concept of power, those who are benefiting and those who are not benefiting. So being able to reform the space in which individuals are operating in a place of beneficiaries and those who are not benefiting is indeed a struggle. And for me, that is why this issue relating to racism is so critical, that people can understand we don't have to live with it. Some people, I hear again and again this view, we will never get rid of racism. Racism is going to always be with us. And I say, well, why doesn't it have to be? We can get rid of it. Only those who are prepared to be comfortable with it will live with this idea that we have to live with it. I just cannot live with this idea that this is how it is. It's kind of like poverty. We're going to always have poor people. Well, no, we do not have to live with poverty. It is because we have beneficiaries and those who are not benefiting why we have that kind of a justification. So I hope that gives a feel for how I can start this conversation.
Okay, well, thank you also for your starting shot here in the discussion. And as we titled today's panel discussion, Biases of Intercultural Theory, Eila, just to come to you, what is intercultural communication theory? What are we exactly talking about? And what are, for instance, the other type of theory you work with and talking about the contexts you're working in, and it's not contextualized?
Yeah, I think that is an excellent question, because specifically, I think in Europe, the intercultural communication is not very established as an academic field. Like communication as a subject is much more established in the US. But anyhow, in Europe, we have it's research in many different disciplines. And because of that, it's based on different ideas what research is about. So there are people working in linguistics, education, business and management, etc. And the knowledge production in these different fields, it's quite diverse, like including what is considered as a goal of research, what's characteristics of good research, what you are aiming at. And I think like the business environments where a lot of interculturalists are working, or it may be a large group of people, or maybe it's simply appreciate a vocal group of people. I don't know. There's maybe some hierarchy there as well. Anyways, like this, it's attached to business quite a lot. So for that reason, the way how business and management construct knowledge often prevails also in intercultural communication theory. But as such, I know that the community of interculturalists is very diverse, but it's unfortunately not so often manifested as such. Mm-hmm. I know that there are groups of people, me included, who engage with neuroscience, social psychology, etc. You're looking how individual makes sense and interprets experiences, things, which are very important as well. But they are individually based. Again, we come to that problem that we based easily the responsibility, whatever, of action on individual. And there the system is missing. And again, there is a danger to ignore the privileged positions what people may have. So for me, in generally, I think that I was missing fields that are more involved in examining how the grassroots level communication is intertwined with community, society, politics, economics, global systems, etc. What Livingstone was talking about, and other people as well earlier, Amer. I think that these are not there, are connected so much are connected with this tendency not to look so much on power, not to analyze so much on power. Like, for example, my field of critical sociolinguistics, which is I'm only entering to. So I cannot say all through, but like this idea that understanding the language as a set of communicative practices that are never neutral, but instead they always reflect larger sociopolitical and historical context and are mediated by different ideologies. So when we are looking the language, when we are looking the communication, we need to take this larger environment into account. And that is present in the language. That is somehow discursively constructed, how we construct the other in the speech, how we construct the race. It's also a social construct in the speech, in our practices, and so on. So this intertwining of language and communication with larger socio-political, historical, political, economic context is, for me, very important. And I think critical sociolinguistics is one that brings one perspective to that. I think anthropology has a lot to give, like specifically methodologically. If we look like, for example, how to produce thick descriptions instead of looking at from certain small angle, and look at like really what is there, what kind of complexity we see in those situations and contexts we are looking at. I'm involved also with migration studies, obviously, because looking the asylum seekers situation, and there comes quite a lot of useful concepts. I can come back to later to that as well. But then critical race theory, that was already examined in earlier one of the earlier series what we had in SIETAR, and also the decolonial and post-colonial theories that were mentioned before. And if I just shortly say that there are also intercultural communication researchers in the academy who are working with the concept of social justice and paying attention to power, such as Thomas K. Nakayama, who has been exploring whiteness and power already at 90s. Then about critical intercultural communication with Rona Tamiko Halualani, intercultural communication, a critical perspective is one of her books, or Catherine Sorrells, who has been writing about globalization, intercultural communication, globalization and social justice, and so on. So there are some, but I don't see that they would have been there. There would be a very wide engagement with these theories.
Yeah. No, well, thank you for giving us this angle and mentioning all the related fields, but also the emerging fields, and where are the voices and do they come through? Amer, you've been working, and you already mentioned, mainly on the field also of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And how has intercultural theory, well, either helped you or hindered you also in this work?
Yeah, well, and I didn't mention that I've always interfaced with international education in my in my work, which is highly siloed and separated in institutions and organizations in the U.S. They operate in completely different spaces usually, and there's a deep distrust in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion of global education, because it's oftentimes, especially as institutions and organizations move to globalize higher education or globalize organizations, it oftentimes was at odds resource-wise with the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And with the lack of the social justice lens that oftentimes exists in those spaces, there was a sense that, oh, the institutions, the organizations are prioritizing this global neoliberal capitalistic kind of way of having these conversations, as opposed to rectifying the historic inequity and harm. And so it created this binary dynamic, bifurcated dynamic. And so when one brings in an intercultural approach into a US diversity, equity, and inclusion space, it can often be met with distrust, because intercultural in many people's minds is international, because those are the people that use these concepts and these theories, and they don't talk about power. And I want to take one concept in particular, code switching. So amongst many communities of color, code switching is viewed as a negative thing in the US. I literally have colleagues in the field of diversity, equity, inclusion that wear shirts that say too tired to code switch, because the perception is the marginalized group is the one that's always having to adapt, that's always having to code switch. The dominant group never has to, and it's exhausting. And what the interculturalist oftentimes does not acknowledge is the power dynamic of how that in real world circumstances, how that plays out, who is actually having to adapt and who is not having to adapt, right? Mm-hmm. And so as a result of that, without an explicit articulation of some are generally having to adapt more than others around whatever social identity we're talking about, right? Without an acknowledgement of that, right? What that is, how that is heard to a group that is historically and systemically marginalized, oftentimes is you are an advocate of assimilation. You want me to simply assimilate and give up the things that make me me in order to accommodate and make things work for the dominant group. Without an explicit power analysis, it is almost impossible to get through that resistance for so many people who do the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And so for me, I've been navigating that for over a decade and a half, 2 decades of in my field. And so literally there are times in which I am brought in after an interculturalist to clean up the anger, frustration, and resistance of professionals who do work on diversity, equity, and inclusion in an organization, because of how resistant they have been to what was said by the interculturalists prior. And so I have to translate and have to be able to present it a different way and bring that explicit power analysis and show them how it connects, and also why it's important to bring that kind of synergized lens into a globalized way of thinking about it. Because the world is not US and the world is a relationship between the local and global. And we bring in Livingstone's notions of capitalism in relationship to this. That's what this is all about. That's why race was constructed, particularly the way that it was in the US and South Africa. And what I've been trying to get folks in the US to understand is that this is our form of colonialism. The challenge in the US is because of the kicking out of the British kind of that happened. There's this kind of idea that we're somehow exempt from the colonial process. But what I've been trying to help people here understand is that this is our version of the same process, right? It's a method of divide and conquer, right? And I think for a lot of Europeans, these notions were not domestic, right? This was not railroad tracks like it is here, literally railroad tracks that divide towns and communities throughout this, and people navigating this stratification of race and class and gender and sexual orientation, right? But particularly race and class and the intersection of those two pieces. Whereas I think for many Europeans, it was out there, right? And it felt abstract. And suddenly the people from out there that had been colonized were living where they lived, right? And all of a sudden it's less abstract, right? All of a sudden it's not this idea that I can convince myself that I'm so loving and accepting and inclusive in the absence of the people that have been colonized actually being in my neighborhood, right? And I think that's a big part of what Europe is reconciling right now. There's an organizing phrase, we are here because you were there, right? And so until that is reconciled, right? And I know that not every immigrant group is from the places that have been colonized, but many are, right? And until that's reconciled, that there's a reason why French and Algerian and Senegalese people and people from Mali in their ancestry are living in France and are having a particular experience in France, or whatever group we're talking about, whether it's UK or wherever, right? So we have to be able to reconcile that colonial history and with the implications of what I say oftentimes is that I'm not attached to the word race. What I'm attached to is the phenomenon, right? We have a particular history in the United States of how it was specifically constructed, right? Right, and with Latin America, a lot of folks say, well, we don't have this race thing. We don't have racism. But yet somehow when I go to the barrios and go to the favelas, I can get a sense of who's living there. And then I can go to the elite neighborhoods throughout Latin America and see it looks like a very different constituency of people generally. And who's in the marketing, who the politicians are, who the elite are, and what they just generally tend to look like. You don't have to call that racism, but we need to acknowledge that phenomenon, right? And deal with the historical context of power and inequity that has facilitated that process, right? And what is similar and different about that across these various contexts.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Amer. And I saw you nodding in the meantime, Christian. And you have been also very vocal, also in your podcast and live streams about all these issues. You've been working as an interculturalist. What is intercultural theory for you, and how do you intersect this currently with also racial and social justice?
Well, as I said earlier, I'm not really sure if I'm the best person to answer the theory portion of it, because
you're the person here, and you speak from your heart and from your practice.
I'm at odds with the theory sometimes, because the intercultural theory, at least the ones that I've been introduced to over the course of my career, is often very it takes a very limited or limiting point of view as it resorts to nationalities, and I think we as a field, I think most of us have moved way past that already. Not to discredit the work that has been done fundamentally, however, remaining in the country comparison is not serving anyone, and I'm a bit surprised how sometimes the intercultural theory is, I'm not saying all of it, but some of it is disregarding personal history, or even more important, what Amer just said, analyzing power systems, power distribution that was oftentimes built with a certain intent by design, sometimes evolved organically, and the inequities in that structure were never addressed because it served certain people and they were very comfortable in having it that way and maintaining it that way. So what I recognize for myself as being pale and male and hopefully not stale in the work here in the US is that by my appearance, when I enter the room or when I'm introduced to a client, the initial expectation is, oh, another white guy, middle-aged white guy. All right. So it's only after I open my mouth and share a little bit about my experience and they hear my accent and then they recognize, oh, he's not from here. Okay, so he's not our average middle-aged white guy. So only if I add layering, only if I add nuance, do I get the permission to analyze the power structure, or maybe even, depending on the room that I'm in, tearing it down. And that is sometimes a very painful process, I recognize. I've been in rooms in my native culture where I tore down or disassembled the power balance or made light of the power balance and rattled at it. And I've been in rooms here in North America where I did the same thing. So being a white guy in a majority white society, whether it's in Germany or here in the US, I still am seen as the representative of the dominant ethnicity or the dominant quote unquote race. And only if I verbalize and vocalize my alliance with disadvantaged and marginalized parts of the population does that perception of me change. And I think what we as interculturalists, and I don't want to speak for all of us, but what I recognize for myself is if I dislike the concept of race, if I dislike the perpetuation of that narrative, then I can't wait for the marginalized and disadvantaged people to be done with their fight for equity. Because then I would still make it about them fighting for what's rightfully theirs. So I recognize that as part of the dominant group, as part of the group that comes with privilege or power, I have to be part of the people who dismantle some of that power. I'm not taking anything away from my privilege. And this is something that I sometimes struggle to portray or to bring across in programs, is by giving other people or granting other people the same space and the same seat at the same table, your table isn't getting smaller and your seat isn't getting any wobblier or smaller. It's where you're not giving up your whiteness, you're not giving up your privilege. So, but being the dismantler of these power systems comes with a challenge. I recognize it. I've gotten some flack, I've gotten some pushback. In the end, however, I think it was able to reconcile some of those interests. And I tend to walk away from it as having been a facilitator to an empowerment process for those who were in the room, regardless of their backgrounds. Now, I come at this with a very unique perspective, right? I'm a child of the 70s and 80s. I'm German. I come with my cultural historical baggage, and I come with a history of, or with an experience of dealing with inherited pain. And I think a lot of the perpetuation we see around race in many cultures around, or in many nations around the world, is that pain has not been resolved. So if we allow pain to fester, if we allow the wound to develop pus and bleed and still reinfect itself, then we're going to continue with that challenge. And I'm not saying Germany did it right or better. That's not my point. However, I come from an experience where we took, as a society, we took an approach to our pain and to the pain that we inflicted on others. It's not resolved. It will never be done. If I don't, and this is what my Jewish mentors told me, if we don't acknowledge the pain of the victims, we're going to feel that pain for ourselves forever. So deal is painful. Dismantling power is empowering, but it takes our willingness to do so.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much also for your personal touch on this. And Livingstone, I come to you next. We're talking here about intercultural theory and whether it helps or hinders us, but also we're here at this level of pain. You're also working in interreligious, interfaith dialogue. So this might also relate to the work you do and on a very humane level.
Yeah, that's true, Ivan, thanks. And well, first of all, I think for the individuals who have attempted and those who are currently working on refining, or those who worked to establish the theories and framework, I think, you know, it is fair that we commend the efforts that have been made to try and develop understanding. I believe for the most part, these things were undertaken, these ventures were undertaken with a view to try to understand from the point of view where they were located. So I don't think we have to engage in this space as in any way the critique should anyway be appearing to not appreciate the hours that individuals spend long nights and doing research and trying to make sense of the reality. And we all have the need to be aware of the biases that we bring to our own, to the work we undertake. And one of the unfortunate things in relation to the theories that have been developed is that there have not been a sufficient awareness of the limitations that they've had and the way in which they're culturally situated. Many of the theories were predicated on European philosophy that would have, and sociology that would have been articulated as global understanding and right for everyone, because of the way in which the movement of Europeans into regions beyond Europe led to a situation where it was felt that the other could be managed, enslaved, educated, and be, in a sense, domesticated into a system which says that the other is unfortunate in the conditions that they are, how unfortunate it is to be the other. And what was the European education system, notions, values, and terminology, that was the point of reference. A lot of that assumption is built into the theories as they have developed. So the way in which the other is described, it has tended to be either in a kind of a paternalistic way or in a way that tends to construe the other as being primitive or primordial in their development, and therefore there is a sense in which the development needs to happen in the other to match what is the European. And I think that in a way that is a piece of work that we have to do to recognize the limitations that were built and the, if you like, the philosophical prejudices that were built, and it's the ground on which many of these would have been constructed. And let me just illustrate it with reference to two concepts that we find a lot in intercultural theory, in intercultural communication theory. One is the person as the one who is doing the communicating. The concept of person as it exists in a European philosophical context, you will find that that concept of person as atomic does not exist in the same way in a traditional Confucian philosophical framework or in an African philosophical framework. That the concept of the individual as representing a force that is interdependent is something that is much more akin to certainly an African philosophical framework. So when the theories, for example, use the concept of person or the individual as representing an atomic center, as initiating action, that concept is a European concept. So when we speak about communication as initiating, the individual initiating communication, as sending information, and as a center of interpretation as an individual in their own right, that has its limitation and should be recognized. But yet we tend to work with those as global and normal. Another example of something that is at the basis of some of these theories also relates to maybe what we may call the concept of time, and how time is understood in intercultural communication theory and intercultural theories as well. Appreciating the diversity in the conception of time is so critical. And again, I will use an example from the African context, where if we use the European concept of time as past, present, and future, in that sense, we call it three-dimensional, you'll find that in some African context, certainly in the West, in what we may call the Mid and Eastern African context, that concept of time does not predominate. Time, for the most part, is two-dimensional. It is present and past. So that time is a relationship between events as they have occurred. And events can only have happened or events are happening. There is no, an event cannot be in the future. And therefore the concept of time as relating to the composition of events is two-dimensional. And yet in an Akan conception of time, say in Ghana, in Western Africa, they are much more at home with past, present, future. Although future, in many other languages, there's no word for future. So the concept of future does not exist at all in some language. And then there in other language in which it is not thematized, because the whole concept of the future as being a possibility and people being at home with the present, this is what predominates. So I use that to illustrate how then when we use the notion of past, present, and future as a normal conception of time, in which thing is operating, how that has its limitation, and appreciating the diversity, how critical that is. Where are you whose concept of time are you talking about when you say time?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this contribution. And as we're talking in this webinar and in this panel discussion about biases of intercultural theory, we've already covered a lot of biases throughout talking about intercultural theory, and of course, power and privilege, language, the context originated, and many more. Let us transfer towards implications, towards what does this say? What does this tell us? Many of us are practitioners working with participants on daily basis. Eila, what do you think? What are the applications of everything we've discussed so far?
Yeah, I think one could look at from the point of view as a practitioner, but also as an intercultural community. I think that is an essential perspective. If I start by myself, I think the process of self-reflection in relation to the privilege is what I have, and it's very important one. Like recognizing them, how I have used them, how I have benefited them. Like do that kind of reflection is an important one. And then I find also that, for example, taking the role of anthropologist of the everyday life, like that kind of, I'm not using the term neutral because I don't believe that you can neutrally look anything, but anyways, like to try to build and learn from the community where you are at, not only from the present, but as it has been said many times about the historical background as well. And if I come back to the example, me being in doing the field work in the asylum center, like then looking the perspective of the people who came here to look for asylum, and look the country, Finland as a country. So I have to say that I had to, my whole idea of the Finland as a country changed. You know, this kind of like also this realization that how we ourselves are part of this narrative of whatever, wherever we come from, whatever group we are part of, but what kind of narratives are created and maintained and reconstructed in everyday practices, and how it is a narrative, but it's also a reality for people who look it from only from one's own perspective. So that idea that we try to find, involve with other bubbles, if one wishes, other perspectives, like this kind of humbleness to look and really consciously try to find, specifically for people like me who are like in Finland belong to majority and like have this kind of hegemonic position in there. So it's, I think that kind of humbleness is extremely important, and also gives space for the perspectives that people with different backgrounds have, and be silent for a while and listen. I think that is absolutely very important, not only as a human being, but also as a researcher and trainer. And sometimes that is something that one needs to really learn more. I think that as a community, when I refer to these different kind of academic knowledge where perspectives to intercultural communication are produced, they are in so different ways. So one single person has not easy means to get into them. So I think in this is the side where the associations like SIETAR could play an essential role, like to ask and do how to bring to the congresses, to discussions, to workshops, current updated perspectives from fields that may not be so familiar or may not be something that we ultimately look for, and even like very consciously develop links and connections with the work that interculturalists do. Maybe that's.
Well, thank you. And thank you for this two-level response, the personal response and also the community level. Amer, how is this for you? What are the implications that we're discussing today, and how can we put, well, all the audience here, but you yourself, how can we put this in practice and also as a community?
Yeah, so again, I've tried to highlight that the blending of the two approaches is important. And yes, there's been critical interculturalists in graduate programs in various places, but it does need to filter into the practical level. But here's why it's so important not to overcorrect. Okay, because I've learned the lesson from the other side, coming from an anti-racism, social justice lens, which oftentimes was hitting people over the head with stuff they weren't ready for, right? And so I always articulate the intercultural intervention as the more effective intervention strategy to get people on the journey, to think of themselves within the process of development and on that journey, so that as they buy into the importance of developing intercultural skills, that you can introduce the equity lens along the way in a way that's meaningful and recognizing, oh, that's the next step. And as Eila mentioned, that we all have to kind of pay attention to the ways in which we are positioned in relationship to our various social identities. And so for me, having to do a lot of work around being a cisgendered male, and that's cisgendered meaning that I identify with the gender that I was sexually assigned with. And as a heterosexual and as an able-bodied individual, and then modeling, right, what it means to stand as an ally with those who are marginalized around that identity, so that others are willing to do their work around the areas in which they may have advantages around a particular part of their social identity. So if the learner feels attacked and that they have all the work to do, and we're not willing to sit in a space of learning and growth and development and not knowing around the areas in which we benefit, that makes it harder for the learner to see themselves within that journey of and development, and the willingness to make mistakes along the way. And this is part of how we've gotten to this space in the US of what we call the woke Olympics, of who's trying to kind of out social justice one another and who's more correct, and this purity test that is really not helpful because all of us are learning, all of us make mistakes. And so we've gotten into this place where on that side, on that kind of social justice side, where we're not creating the room for growth and development. And that's where I think the opportunity is for the interculturalist, is in the blended approach, to bring people on that journey, to go on that journey ourselves, and to introduce the equity lens in a way in which people want to take ownership and investment over that process for themselves, and of course organizations as well. And again, challenging organizations that we're not just looking for diversity, we're not looking just for representation. We want to go on a journey of building equity and inclusion in our organizations as well. And then how do we build the policies, the practices and procedures to build the capacity to be able to live in that over time.
Okay, well, thank you so much for giving here your views. And Christian, just from your point of view, what are the implications and what do you do as a practitioner? And what are your tips? Amer is saying something about making mistakes, having these conversations. What is it for you?
Well, I think the woke Olympics, that's a thing, at least here in North America. And usually the top athletes in the woke Olympics are those who remain in their respective bubbles. They're the ones that are the high performers in woke Olympics. Once you step out of your bubble and enter other parts of your environment, then I found that humbling, because I recognize that my wokeness isn't serving me at all. I simply have to go with what is. And this is how I blend it in my work. Intercultural theory, all nice and well. I use it to the extent that it serves my clients or the people that I work with. What I focus on is the individual and their story and how it blends into their reality. So intercultural theory serves me only to a certain degree. So there's aspects of psychology that come in. There's aspect of of personal socioeconomic history as it relates to an individual's journey in their global work, or as an organizational journey. So blending multiple approaches is, I think, the way to go, depending on what skill sets you have individually as a facilitator, as a trainer, or whatever your work in the intercultural field is. So that was the implication for me to move away from a limited toolbox. I've been working on expanding my toolbox as much as I can. So and it's not by no means complete. I'm still looking for additional tools, and that's one of the reasons why I'm happy to be here, because I'm hoping to learn from you, which I did, and also get some input in the follow-up. What are some models that we, with our Western approach, quote unquote Western approach, are missing? Because I know that my perception is very biased, and I'm not going to discredit bias in and by itself. We all are biased for a reason. Our human brain is wired to be biased, otherwise we probably wouldn't survive. But recognizing when our biases serve us and when they are disadvantageous in a certain situation is, I think, the kind of wokeness that I would like to strive towards. So by all means, if there's models, intercultural models, any type of communication models that are not based on European and Western theory, I would like to hear them, see them, feel them, get my hands on them, reach out to me and further the dialogue. I'd be happy to have it.
Okay, and let's start a collection also on these, because in this webinar you've already mentioned many fields and resources. Livingstone, what is it for you? Where are the implications?
Yeah, there are a couple of things I believe that for us, as we are involved in the conversation in the field, whether we are academics or practitioners, it seems to me that there are a number of things that it behoves us that we should always aim to do. And as I speak, this is something that I work on for myself personally. And so I not as presenting myself as an example in any way, but as I see imperatives as they come to us. And the first thing, I believe it's important that there is always a need for us to unmask what I call the philosophical bases of the things that we're talking about, to understand that they are not neutral, that they have a history. And if we're going to be working with, whether they be concept or so, to appreciate where they have come from, how they have been influenced, and use them with a certain amount of necessary health warning when they have to be used, and to understand their limitation, but also the appropriateness of their application. That's the first thing that I think that I see is critical. The second thing, which I believe that is important, is to be clear about the assumptions that we are working with in terms of our own, whether in terms of our own biases, but to understand our own assumptions, that we are not, if you like, neutral individuals working in the space that we're working. We bring our own interpretative framework, we bring our own biases, but it doesn't mean that they are without value, but they are significant for understanding and for giving a sense of both integrity and also an appreciation for the application of the things we say. So that's something that I believe is important. The third thing that I think, for me, in any case, that is important, is that we should be very cautious about, well, in our field, we have to speak a lot to people and about people. And we are often found to be making statements about others. Very often others whom we do not know, never met, never studied, and how important, therefore, it is to, in a way that probably might mimic humility, if not be genuine humility, to develop a measure of understanding about individuals and groups about whom we would attempt to speak and make descriptions. That there is nothing that can gainsay how important it is to try and understand the people we are talking about, and in some way. So I would be very cautious about making statements about the you know, the individuals described as the Aboriginal Australians. I've never been there in the first place, and I assume that there are many things about them which I have heard that have been mediated through people who have dominated them, and therefore I don't have to repeat the same thing as if it is absolutely accepted as so. I need to get perspective, and so I will be cautious how I use the terminologies in describing them. And the last thing I'd say, how important it is to truly appreciate and work with diversity. We have tended to to turn or to leverage things in relation to dominant groups in whichever context. And so if we are working in a Western Nigerian context, it may well be that the dominant groups that we are aware of, we make allusions and references to them as if to say, that is Nigeria sorted for understanding. That is not fair to the groups that may be smaller numerically, but also it means that they are being left out. By the same token, when we speak about the United Kingdom and England, there are large swathes of individuals who have always lived there, whose understanding of themselves and the culture and the country have not entered into popular description of the place. We do not have to repeat the same problem. We don't have to perpetuate that sense of injustice against others. There's an imperative to be truly appreciative of diversity and to deal with it. It is our craft, so to speak, as interculturalists, we may say. We should practice in that sense what we preach and what we claim.
Well, thank you so much. And as we're coming, well, to the final wrap up, of course, in the meantime, the chat has been a very active place for the panelists. I don't know whether you had time to have an eye on the chat as well. And in the same time, we had some questions coming in. And there's one question that I do want to have a moment for. The title of the seminar is Bias of Intercultural Communication Theory. Could one of the panelists describe a particular theory of intercultural communication and describe how it's biased? And also with an additional comment like, is it possible to have intercultural communication theory which is not at all culture-centered? So that's like the addition to this question. Who likes to answer this? May I see a hand of any of you? Amer, may I give you the floor, please?
Well, I've been making reference a lot to concepts in the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, and again, it's that navigating the complexity of similarities and differences, these core competencies and skills to developmentally move along a continuum. And, we can even just talk about a linear continuum as a Western Eurocentric kind of way of framing in the first place, as opposed to something that is more spiral and more circular in process, that's more clearly articulating an unending journey of learning and development. But then, yes, as I mentioned, the lack of an explicit power analysis there makes it very difficult to be able to explicitly, and again, I'm not talking about just simply, high context, low context. I'm just saying that the marking and naming of power as a factor in how we navigate who we are in relationship to one another, right? And then, because by not doing that, by not bringing in other concepts and ideas, that we miss the fact that it's missing, and therefore in our practice, we can miss that. So I'll give you an example. I went to an intercultural conference and went to a presentation, US one, and it was a international education office that brought a group of students from Iraq every summer for a month. And they did a cultural exchange. And, they talked about all the different kind of cultural exchange they did with American students and these Iraqi students. And so during the Q&A, I asked a question. I said, so at any point in the month in which this interaction was happening, did you address the fact that our country has invaded their country multiple times? oh no, we just wanted to have a cultural exchange. And I'm like, well, I imagine, and again, I don't want to assume what the Iraqi students were thinking, but I imagine it may have been a factor for them that they're standing in the country that has devastated their country and their lives and their realities time and time again. And we're just not going to sit, we're just not going to talk about it. We're just not going to engage it at all. Like that to me is a wholly inadequate reality and a complete lack of acknowledgement of a power dynamic in a counter in the name of cultural exchange. And again, who benefits from that exchange? Who benefits from that encounter? Is it the Iraqi student? Or is it these American students who don't have to deal with those implications whatsoever, right? No. So, and then in terms of culture, I've always used a broad definition of culture to not only be encompassing ethnicity with regards to intercultural work. So we could be talking about a culture that exists around sexual orientation. We could be talking about a culture that exists around gender and so forth. One last concept to bring from the diversity, equity, inclusion space in the US is the concept of intersectionality. The idea that these social identities exist uniquely at the intersections, so that the experience of a Black American queer woman is different than a white American queer woman, right? And then we see these things show up in social science around the implications of the experiences of certain groups, especially as related to hate and bias at certain intersections, right? And so it's important for us to be able to recognize that when we look at power around social identities, we're also thinking about how they intersect, right? Yeah. And then one last thing is that
final last thing, yes.
Very clear that social identities are constructed differently in different contexts. So it's important to encourage people to reflect on what they understand the social constructs and equities. So if you're in India, I saw in the chat at one point, okay, yeah, you may have a very hard time understanding the concept of race, right? Okay, so let's talk about caste. Let's talk about religion. Let's talk about other elements of social stratification, right? And reflect on what those may be and how you may be positioned in relationship to these social identities in your context.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much, Amer, for answering also this specific question. There are more coming in, but also time-wise, we're about to wrap up. So I want to give the final words to this panelist for today. And also, I think we covered a lot of topics. We've seen the complexity in many angles. And it's not only about theory, it's also how we work with the theory, how we as practitioners and in our attitude and behavior and consciousness work with it, and also take an humble approach sometimes, being listening. Christian, may I ask you first to have like one final thought, 1-2 sentences time-wise?
Yeah, I don't need a lot of time. I would echo a lot of what Amer and Livingstone and Eila said here before. I think the models that we've been using in our field are structurally sound to a certain degree, unless we, or that they will become unuseful if we don't acknowledge for the biases we discussed here today. As we are evolving as practitioners in the field, we should always challenge the models that we've been using for such a long time. Do they stand the test of time in that regard? And there, I saw the question in the chat or in the Q&A. I think all of the models, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, they all suffer from a racist bias or from a Eurocentric perspective. So that doesn't make the model in and by themselves wrong or not helpful. We can amend them or at least account for those nuances that some of us, including myself, have been missing over the years. And what I said earlier, the models are fine, but I don't want to rely on these academic constructs singularly. There's so much more to be had in the individual exchange that these sometimes rather theoretic concepts fail to explain in the way that our clients come to us. They are not academics in this field. They're not trained the way many of you are. So where does the rubber meet the road is in the individual interaction. Sometimes these models won't do the trick. I don't like the word trick. They won't serve us in that regard. Yeah. That's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being here with us today. Livingstone, may I go to you, and also like a final thought?
Yeah, final thought. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks to the colleagues who have shared, and to the individuals, the 160 plus of them who are obviously themselves very wise individuals who themselves could have been part of this panel to make the contribution. So I do appreciate the wisdom that exists in that space. And as regarding the area of communication, intercultural communication theory, there, as I understand it, without being specific to a theory, but in terms of the theories in general, have within them, there are at least three things that were present in these theories. Is a concept of the human being or person, is a concept of the systems of interpretation of what is received, and there's the thing that is sent or received, whether it is word, text, or other what may be called the informational carrying system. That these are part of the theories, and it is important to appreciate that these concepts are culturally mediated, and that they are also in many ways limiting. And we should make the assumption that all theories have limitations, all theories have biases, and therefore it is appreciated what these are. So we should never approach a theory as if it is bias-free, not culturally located, because then we would be having, I think, a less than accurate way of appreciating the fact that we all have biases.
Well, thank you so much for these final thoughts. Eila.
Yeah, one word about the biases still. I think one which actually Amer was also mentioning about, like, so-called methodological nationalism, that how often we refer to nation and assume there's an assumption that nation is the most important category in defining how the person is. And well, every one of us can think how much that actually is true. But this idea of intersectionality, that we cannot just leave aside how the race, class, gender, age, etc. all diversify the experience that person has despite the same nationality. And I think that is one of the big biases of many of the theories, that it's just simply too general in order to have any explanatory power, so to say. Maybe the last word for me would be more of an ethical consideration, like as trainers, consultants, researchers, whatever, we represent also a gatekeeper, and thus we have power ourselves. So the questions like, what do we do with this power, and what do we do with this space, what we have in our use with those groups who we have? What is the intercultural responsibility that you and me and we want to, participate in? I think that is an important discussion we need to do as well.
The ethics of our field and of our profession. Well, thank you so much for adding that. Also, in the final words to the discussion, Amer, what is your final thought after having this conversation?
Yeah, well, I'm really hopeful and optimistic. Some of you may be aware that I've been kind of on this soapbox for a long time. And so I'm really excited about the direction of the field, that there is so much energy and interest. I do think that de-emphasizing the nation state is critically important. I think that point, it was really important, because many nations were created out of the colonial process that strategically, specifically marginalized particular groups. And when we use nation, almost by definition, the nation state erases almost every indigenous identity on the planet. So we have to continue to learn. We have to continue to grow. We got to continue to co-create the trajectory of this field together. There is no pre-existing best practices in place in what we're talking about. But this is the direction we need to go, and I'm excited to co-create that journey with you all.
Well, thank you so much. I can say also on behalf of the board of directors of SIETAR Europa, I'm also very excited about the conversation we're having and all the conversations as a continuing journey. And those are the words that we've been echoing as well. Like, we're learning a lot, we're learning from and with each other. And this is also where the change comes, and also from introspection, from reflection. And that's exactly what we aimed for with this series, discussing and checking and redefining the concepts we work with, but also our profession until the very heart of the ethics, etc. So thank you all for being here, all attendees staying until the very end. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it. And yes, the recordings will become available online in the YouTube channel. I also like to mention the next editions that we have of the Anti-Racism Learning Series. Already on January 13th, we have Pritima Chanaini Barta here with us, The Change Within, Liberating the Colonized Mind. And on March 3rd, we have Understanding the Influence of Power Relations in the Dialogue about Racism, together with Sheda Buurman-Kutzel. Plan and register for these sessions, and I'm sure we see each other online again. Wishing you a great afternoon, evening, wherever you're based. Sleep well if it's already very late, and see you next time. And thanks also to the virtual events team. Thanks for the colleagues moderating the chat. And most of all, thank you panelists. So Eila Isotalus, Amer Ahmed, Livingstone Thompson, and Christian Hoerfle. Thank you very much for being here with us and for sharing everything that you shared today. And have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, for moderating. All the best, colleagues. Good to talk to you.
Thank you so much,
Thank you
everybody.
all.
Thank you, Yvonne.
Thanks.
Very much.